The first concepts that we will learn in React are the basics of React components and JSX. And using them, we will start developing our first basic React apps. So let us begin by understanding React components. So what are React components? React components let you split the UI into independent reusable pieces and think about each piece in isolation. So the components give us a great method to break the code into independent reusable pieces and also visualize and think and conceptualize them as independent pieces in isolation. Components make the code modular, easier to manage and understand, and reusable. A React component has a render method which renders a React element into the DOM. So, as we know, React maintains a virtual DOM, and a component has a render method which renders it, which you can imagine as saying that it generates the HTML for the DOM for that component. React components also have a built-in state object, which is referred to as state. And the state object is where you store property values that belong to that component. So this state object is a JSON object and it stores the property or the data that belongs to that component. And when the state object changes, the component re-renders. So it detects the change in the state and it re-renders itself. An important concept in React is JSX. So what is JSX? JSX stands for JavaScript XML and is a syntax extension to JavaScript. It has HTML like syntax and is easy to read, and JSX produces React elements. So important to understand that JSX is a syntax extension, and the purpose of JSX is to make the code writing in React very easy to read and intuitive. A concept that we will be using in our JSX, and this will become easier when we and clearer when we use it, is React.Fragment. A common pattern in React is for a component to return multiple elements. So imagine a DOM rendering itself, a component rendering itself. So it could have, say, two divs, it could have multiple h1s or whatever in it. So multiple elements in it. However, there is a rule that a JSX expression must have a single parent. So the JSX that we were talking about must have a single parent. So React.Fragment or the fragments are used to group multiple children in a single parent without adding extra nodes to the DOM. So if you have multiple of these elements, you can just put them into a React fragment, and we will see it in the example, without having an impact on the DOM. Then there is this concept of JSX expression. So JSX expression is a way to use a JavaScript expression in JSX. Any valid JavaScript expression can be put inside curly braces in JSX. JSX expressions can be used inside if statements and for loops, assigned to variables, accepted as arguments, returned from functions. So typically, like any other parameter, any other variable, any other data type, we can use JSX expressions. So let us go through a few examples and these concepts will start becoming clearer. So in our first example, what we will do? Define a component that renders hello world. So we will create a new component and we will render hello world using that. So let us go to our Visual Studio Code. And how do we create our component? So in our source folder, let us create a new folder and say call it components. So this is where we will create our components. And inside this, let us create our new file and let me call it, say, hello world.jsx. So the extension we will give is a JSX, and whenever we define a component, the standard is to give it a name. So we will just call it hello world, camel case, name to it. Now inside a component, what will we do? Let's just look at the code for a component. So now inside this, how do we start it? Import React, comma, and in brackets we will say component from React. Then let's define class, let's call it say hello world. That's the standard convention. So whatever we have given the file name, but starting with the first letter as capital. Extends component. We'll define a state which will be an empty state right now, and that we will discuss in our next examples as we go through. And next, as we said, we would have the render method. And in the render method, we can just say return h1 hello world. And at the end of the class, what we would say is export default hello world. So this is our standard way of defining a component. There are other ways to define a component, but as we go ahead in our later lessons and videos, we will touch upon them. It is enough that we learn one and the most common ways of defining component and start using that. Once we have defined it, what we can do is we can go to our index.js and we can say import components slash import hello world from components slash, and what was it, hello world, and there should be a dot before it. So dot slash hello world. And the next thing we can just go ahead and say here is that what we want to render, instead of rendering app, we want to render this component hello world. So I can just say hello world here. You can see this has gotten recompiled, and now if I go to the browser and see, and you can see we get hello world here. So on the browser, this has changed to hello world. So this component is what we are rendering, that we have created here. So this hello world.jsx. Let me make a change to it. So hello world, just for, let's call it say hello world 123. And if I go to my browser and check now, so I just get hello world 123. Define a component that renders the following output. What is React? React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. And note that they have different styles. So we will say use H4 for this, what is React, and we will use para for React is a JavaScript library. So there are two ways you can do it. You can either keep on creating components. So let me just create a component. Let me create a new file and let me call it say my component.jsx. And once we create it, we will continue to use this file for that. So just for the starting part of it, I will just, instead of writing that code again, let me just copy it and I will call this component say my component, export my component, and in my index.js I will update hello world to be my component is what I am using. So let me just test that my component is working. Let me just save this. So let me go to the browser and test it, and it shows me hello world 1 2 3 4 5 6. So now that this structure has come in place, We will continue to use this for all the examples in this lesson. And what you can do is just keep on creating different files here for your purpose. Do not create a new project because that will install node modules again. So that's not preferable. We can use the same React app that we have made. So now what do we want to say here? We want to say here, welcome, what is React? And we want to say put that within an H3. And after that, what do we want to say? We want to say in a para, React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. So now when I put it here, I get a syntax error also. So what is the problem here? So the problem is that we have these two components, an H3 and a para, but these are JSX components. So this way that I have written it here is a JSX component. So in a JSX component, I can put in tags and write it just like HTML, but it should have a single parent. There is an H3 here and a para here, which has created this problem. So there are multiple ways to solve this problem. So the first way to solve it is, the first thing we should do is in our return, we should always encapsulate it into commas. That helps us. We can encapsulate this part within a div, for example. So I can put this within a div, and now you can see this code got formatted. So this is what Prettier did. And now if I go and test it, I get what is React. React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. Let us go and also do an inspect. So in our elements, if I go in my div id is equal to root, I get all my bundles. And if I open it, I get my div and my H3 and my para. So this is what I put in. The only problem is that to solve that, I put in a div extra. Now suppose I don't want to put in a div extra. So what is the way to do it? So that is where we would use a React.Fragment. Now if I go ahead and check it out, you can see I'm getting the same output. And now there is no div extra div here. So div id is equal to root, in which we are getting both these H3 and the P para tag. So that is how we do it. So we have created that and we have put it in a React.Fragment. We needed to put it there because there was no single parent to all this. And this is a Java JSX expression that we have created. Let's look at the next exercise. Define a component whose state has three strings S1, S2 and S3. Render the three strings. So this is a standard mycomp that we are using. So in this we will make a change. So the first thing it says, it has three strings in the state. So in the state, let us define these three strings as say React, S2 is say JavaScript, and S3 is say node.js. Now state, as we know, is a JavaScript object. It's a JSON, and all the data, all the properties of this component are maintained there. We will look at more uses of the state and how to do it in the subsequent lessons. In this lesson, we will just be using state and the data that has been saved within it. So now let's go to our render. And in our render, we want to show all these three strings. H1, I want I want to show the tag the S1. So how could I say it? I can say this dot state dot S1. And notice how we have put in within these braces. So wherever we want a JavaScript expression or we want to use a variable, we will use these braces. So these braces is where we have put it. Let me just save it and let us go to the browser and just see what the output is. And you can see it shows React. So this is what we intended. So these braces are extremely important. Now we want to show the H2. So we will just put another, say, H2, or I can put it in an H1 only. This dot state dot S2. And similarly, we will show the third string H1, this dot state dot S3. Now this will give us a problem. Why? Because there are three elements here, three H1s. There is no single parent. So to solve that problem, what we'll do? We will put this into a React.Fragment. So we have encapsulated it within a React.Fragment, which has given them a single parent. And now let's just go ahead and check in the browser. And we have gotten these three elements. And if we go ahead and look in the inspect, we get these three elements. So we have shown them and used the state. Now we can also have used the object restructuring. So I could have just said let s1 comma s2 comma s3 is equal to this dot state. So standard use of object destructuring. And inside this, instead of saying this dot state, we could have just said s1, s2 and s3. Let's just go ahead and test this. It gives us the same values. For the purpose of testing, let me just make it React.js and JavaScript, or let's call it this way. And we can see the output has changed. So this is a standard way of using object destructuring while we are using with it. The second part of this exercise says define a function that returns a JSX expression rendering the strings and use it to render the strings. So let's define the function. So let's name the function as, say, show strings equal to, it does not take any parameter. And what all do I need to do? I will need to do my object destructuring. So let me get that. And then I need to return my JSX. So let's construct and return the JSX. So now what should we do in our render method? We will just say return, and we will call this function show strings. So the way to call it is we will use this dot show strings. Now this has given us an error, and one of the common reasons why this error occurs is that render does not know that how this JSX expression would work. So let's encapsulate it within the React.Fragment. So if I just put it within a React.Fragment, so I've given it the parent. So now this is done, it's compiled, and if I go ahead and we get the react.js and these files. Let's make a change. Let me just remove this or.js, and we can see that change has happened. So what did we do here? We created this function, And within the render, we called this function because it's a JavaScript expression. So we put these curly braces and we call that function. The second thing we did, we used this here. So just like for the state, we used this dot state. For calling this function also, we used this dot the function name. As it had no parameters, we did not pass any parameters. And we encapsulated it within a React.Fragment to ensure that it had a single parent. Next, define a component whose state has two numbers x and y. Render the two numbers, their sum and the larger number. So let's begin. We have the standard mycomp. So let's say in our state we have two numbers, say x is 20 and say y is 70. Now what do we want to render here? So we want to render the numbers, their sum and the larger number. These are the three things we want to show in our render. So let's put it in. So we can just say h1, or let's just put it, say, I don't want to put it in any tag. I can do it without that also. So let me show you. I can just say number 1 is, and we want to show that value. So I can just say this dot state dot x, or what we could have done earlier is we could have just used object deconstruction. So x comma y is equal to this dot state. Now once we have done it, is I can just is x, number 2 is y, sum is x plus y, and let me just first encapsulate it into a React.Fragment because it has no parent. And we can see all those red lines disappeared, and we want to show the larger number. So larger is, here I can use a ternary, x greater than y, it is x, else it is y. Let's go ahead and look at the output. So number, so the formatting is not nice, so let me just put a br, a break after them. So number 1 is 20, number 2 is 17, sum is 37, larger is 20. We can make changes to the data and test it. Let's make, say, y as 37, and we can see larger is 37 and all that we wanted. So again, here we used object destructuring, and in our render we used these JSX expressions to show the value here. And because there was no parent, we encapsulated it within a React fragment. What's the next part of this exercise? Also render whether the numbers are prime or not. So we want to show here whether these numbers are prime or not. So for that, let's define a function is prime equal to, it takes a number, say num, and it will return whether this number is prime or not. So for that, we will just run a loop for let I is equal to 2, I less than num I plus plus I if num percentage I is equal to 0, which means if num percent is divisible by I, return false, because we have found a factor. Otherwise, at the end of the loop, we will just return true. So we have this function that we have created, and let us use that in the render. So how would we use it? and here we can just say prime is, and I can just put in the value of this dot is prime x. And similarly here for y, I can say that prime is this dot is prime y. So notice again, this was normal text HTML that we are using, and hence I called a Java JSX expression and we put it in these curly braces. Again here it's giving me this suggestion that it should have been a strict equality check. Let's go ahead and look at the output. So we can see number one prime is, it's not giving us a value. Why is it not giving us a value? Because this dot is prime x. Let me just concatenate it with a string. Let's see whether that gives us a value. So it gives us the value false. And the same thing I do here. And 37 is true. So 20 is not a prime and 37 is a prime. So here again we defined a function, used the return value of this function, and then displayed it in a JSX expression in the render. Define a component whose state has an array of numbers. Render the array of numbers as a list. So here we have our mycomp, and in the state we have an array of numbers. So what do we need to do? We need to render this array of numbers as a list. So I can go to my return in my here, and what we can say is I'll put it, I want to render it as a list, so I can just put in within a UL, and within the UL we will just use a map this dot state dot nums. So instead of using it, the standard thing that we would use, I will just say let nums equal to this dot state. So I can just say nums dot map n1 goes to, and what do we want to return here? We want to return a li, and between that li, what value we want? We want the n1. So this is what nums would return. And we can just show that. Let's go ahead and test it. So we get the array of numbers as a list. Notice that in this case we did not use a join, so we did not say dot join space empty string. That typically does not work. It gives us an object, so its join is not used in the case of React in the render here. So we would go ahead and use it without join, and as you have seen, it works perfectly fine. So for the purpose of rendering, we do not need a join for these HTML elements within the map. The second part of the exercise says sort the numbers in ascending order and then render them as a list. So what is our objective? Our objective is to show it in ascending order, so we need to sort nums. So typically as a standard practice, we do not want to change our state variables without explicitly doing them. We don't want to sort them or anything. So we will just say make a copy. So I can just say nums1 is equal to, use the spread operator and create a copy. Once I've created it, I can just use a sort n1 comma n2, and we are sorting in ascending order, so I can just say n1 minus n2. And now that my nums1 is the sorted array, I will use that within my render. Let's look at the output, and we can see it is sorted in ascending order. If we wanted it in descending order, I could have just said n2 minus n1 here in my sort, and it gives me those numbers sorted in descending order. Define a component whose state has an array of students where each student is a JSON. Render the array as a table. So here in my mycomp, in the states, we have this array students, which is an array of JSON. And what do we want to do? We want to show this data in a table. So let's go to our render. So in our render, in the return, let's just put in a React.Fragment. And what would we do within that React.Fragment? We want to show a table. So we will just use a map. What would we use the map on? This dot state dot students. So let's just first do students use object destructuring is equal to this dot state. Now I can say here students dot map st goes to. Now for each student, what do I need to show? I need to create a row. So I can say div. Here what do we use? We don't use class, we would use the word class name. So why do we do that? Because we are using the word class here. So we don't use the word class here, we would use the word class name. So class name is equal to row. Now within this div, what we would say, div class name is equal to, let's say, call 6. And what do we want to show? st dot name. Similarly, what else do we want to show? We want to show st dot maths and st dot English. So this div is closing here as a row, and let's just put it in. We could have also put it within a container. So I could have put it, instead of a React fragment, I could have just called it as, say, div class name is equal to container, and done that. Let's go and look at the output. So there is some issue with it's moving into different columns. So let us just put some border. So row, let me put some border and the borders here also. And why was it moving to the next row? Because I made it 4. So the sum was 12. Instead of 12 was 13. Now I get them in a proper fashion that I wanted. If we wanted to introduce a header row, what would I do? Before my map, I will just put this, create a header row, and there I will just call it, say, name maths, and let's say English. And because it's my header row, I can just say bg dark text white. Let's test it. So I get a table with the header and all those properties that we wanted. What else would we want here? If I wanted to center the marks, so I can just say text center, text center, and I get that output in that fashion. So this is all centered. Let's center the header also. So here we could have said in and this is perfectly fine. Note that if we get into the console, it gives us a warning. Each child in a list should have a unique key property. So what that means is in the map, we are creating these elements. So it says each child in this list. So each child in this list should have a unique property. So we could have done that. And when it's needed, we will start doing it at a later lessons. What does the B part say? Show the row in green if the total is at least 60, otherwise red. So that row for that student should be green if the total, which is the total of the subjects, is 60, otherwise red. So here in the row we will use the color we want to show here. So there are multiple ways to do it. One way to do it is I can just write a function which will return me the class name. So I can just say get row style is equal to, it takes, what does it take? It takes this, I can give it the student object itself. So it can take the student object, or I can even give it the marks in maths and marks 1 and marks 2. So we can do it anyway. So let's just give it the marks of maths 1 and English, the 2 marks. And what does it return? It should return m1 plus m2 greater than equal to 60. If m1 plus m2 is greater than equal to 60, then what should it return? It should return BG success. Otherwise, it should return, let's say, BG, let's call it, say, danger. And I don't need these braces. So I get this function here. So now that we have defined this function, so we will just go to our class name, and there we can just say row border plus this dot get row style st dot maths comma st dot english, and we can just put that. Let's go ahead and test it. So we get Williams, Catherine, and Sophia with the green background. Their scores are greater than 60 some, and George and Timothy as red. So we have achieved our objective. Note that here we are using this st so frequently that we could have also done here is curly brace and used object destructuring here. Let name comma maths comma English equal to st, and then just made this code far more readable. Let's go ahead and test it. And this gives us some problem. Let's see. Once we have put in it, I should have put in a return here. And we get the output. So the moment we just did not have it. It was a multi-line and I put it. I had to put in the return, and with that map we have created the right output that we were looking for. The third part, the C, says filter the array and show only those whose total is at least 60. So here, when we have gotten the students, we can just do a filter. So I can just create, say, another const sts is equal to students dot filter, and what can we say, s1 such that s1 plus maths plus s1 dot english is greater than equal to 60. So we have created the filter, and now instead of using students, I will use sts here. So this should show us our filtered students. Let's test it, and we just get the 3 students. If I change the condition to, say, some other value less than, say, greater than equal to 50, then we also get George, whose total is 55. So we ran the filter and then used it to render this. Let's look at the next exercise. Define a component whose state has the data for a quiz show. Render the data of the players as a table. So here we have in the state an array of players, and for each player we have these 3 fields: name, answered, and correct. So the number of questions the player answered and the questions which were correct in them. And then we have the scoring pattern. So a correct score gets 2 points and an incorrect score gets 1 point. So what we need to render it in a table, and what all do we want to show in that table? We want to show the name, answered, correct, and the score. So we will need to compute the score and also show it. So let's start in the render. The first thing we'll do is let's get the values using object destructuring from the state. So we have players, comma, correct score, comma, incorrect score is equal to this dot state. So far in all these exercises, we have used let. A better practice is to use const, so that you have seen we have rarely changing these values. So const will ensure that if we are changing these values, we do not do it accidentally. We know it. It will throw a error. And if we want to change those values, we'll convert that into let. So now that we have these values, let's go to our render. Let's return div class name is equal to container. Now within this, what do we want to do? We want to use a map on players. So I can say players dot map. A player p1 goes to, let's use object destructuring again. Let name, comma, answered, comma, correct equal to p1. Now what do we want to return for each element of the map? Div class name is equal to row, and within each row we will show div class name is equal to column 6, column 3, let's call it, and border. And what do we want to show? We want to show the name. Next, what do we want to show? We want to show the answered, then we want to show the correct, and we want to show the total points, which would be how many are answered correctly. So correct into correct score plus answered minus correct. So these are the incorrect questions into incorrect score. So we have now displayed all those values and this should return fine. Let's test it. So we get Jack 14, 8 into 2, 16, minus 2, 14. So you can check all those values. They are looking fine to me. Let's put a header on top here. So I can just put a header. Let me just copy this and put it before the map. Name answered correct and score. And let's give it a BG success text. Let's test it. So we have gotten the structure and we have gotten all the points. What does part B say? Show the leaderboard and statistics. So we need to show the leaderboard and we'll show the top 3 players. And then we need to show the statistics, which is total questions, correct answers and incorrect answers. So the first thing we will do is create the leaderboard. And for creating the leaderboard, I need to sort the players. So to sort it first, we'll create a copy. So const players1 is equal to players. Now I need to sort it. So I can just say players1 dot sort. Now the sort would have this kind of a formula in it. So it will get messy. So let me just call it sort players, a function. And let's create this function. Sort players is equal to p1 comma p2. And what does it do? So for p1 and p2 we will need to use this formula. So let me copy it. Let x1 equal to p1 dot correct, and we need correct score and we need incorrect score. So I'll use const correct score comma incorrect score is equal to this dot state. So we have used object destructuring. Once we have gotten it, I can just say p1 dot correct score plus p1 dot answered minus p1 dot correct into incorrect score. So that is x1. Similarly, I'll make a copy and create x2. p2 dot correct into correct score plus p2 dot answered minus this into incorrect score. Now that we have gotten it, I want to sort it in descending order. So I will just return x2 minus x1. Now here this is showing me an error. Why? This should have been this dot sort player so that that function gets called. Now I have players1 as the sorted players. So below the table, I want to show the statistics. So this is where we are. So let me just create another row. Div class name is equal to row, and let me just give it say a row bg light. Now within this, I want to show the players. So I will create column. We want to show players and statistics. So div class name is equal to column 6. And let me give a border. And here what do I want to show? I will say first player is what is players 1 has the objects. So players 1 0 dot name and put a BR. Similarly, I will show player 2 and player 3. So these will be my top 3 players. Let's go ahead and test it. So I get Kathy, William and Jack. If I look at Kathy, Kathy has 19 points, so that's fine. William has 15, that's fine, and Jack has 14. So it is showing us the correct players here. And let me give it a title here. So let me just say H4 leader board. So I get my leaderboard and I can. So now that we have shown the leaderboard, let us show the stats. So for stats, let me just create the so div class name is equal to column 6 border. Now what are the stats we want to show? So let me again say H4 statistics. So the statistics we want to show is total questions, correct answers, and incorrect answers. So this is what we want to show. So we will need to compute the total questions, the correct answers and the incorrect answers. So let's create a function. So let me just create a function for total questions. So total questions is equal to, it does not take a parameter. And what does it do? It will use reduce on players. So I can just say this dot state dot players dot reduce. Now this looks cumbersome, so let me just use object destructuring. Let, and we said we will not use let, so we'll say const players equal to this dot state. Players dot reduce accumulator comma current goes to, and what should we return? Accumulator plus current dot answered. So we get the total questions. Now once we get the total questions, now we just need to give it its starting value, which is 0. So we will just return. So we have gotten our total questions. Once we have gotten our total questions, we can similarly create a function for total correct. So total correct is players dot reduced answered comma correct. So we get the total correct and the total questions. Once we have gotten it, let's create two variables here. Let total questions asked equal to this dot total questions, and let total correct answers is equal to this dot total correct. So we have gotten those values. Let's go ahead and show them. Total questions asked, total correct answers, and hence the incorrect answers is total questions asked minus total correct answers. So it is for the purpose that we wanted to show this value that we saved it in a variable. So let's go ahead and test it. So total questions asked is 63, correct answers is 48, and if we 30, 63 is perfectly fine, 15, 24, 48 is fine. So we have now created the statistics and the leaderboard as we wanted. What is the final part of this exercise say? Show the data in a different non-table format. So far we have been showing it in a table format. Now what do we want to show? We want to show it in a non-table format. So in a non-table format would be that we want to show player like alongside each other. So what do we do? Let us start changing it. So I don't need the header. So there would be no header. There would be a single row within which we will show the players, and a single column, and in this we will just show the players. So like we are doing it for the statistics, in which in a column we are showing all the values, so we will show it. So let's just say name, br, answered, similarly to answered, let me just say correct, and we will need the points score. That's what we called it, and the same formula we will return it, because that formula gives us the correct score. I don't need a BR after score because that's the end of it. And we for. So we have this gets returned, this is fine, this matches the, this matches it, so this is perfectly fine. Then what do we need more? We need to, after that, close this div of the row. So let me close that, and now this seems perfectly fine. Let's go ahead and test it. So as you can see, we have gotten the layout in a different fashion. I could have say made it column 4 so that there are 3 in a row. So this looks much better. And let me give it say a BG. Let's say, so we get a layout. So we have shown it in a different framework. So what we did here was that instead of a table, we just rendered it differently. And what it tells us is the power of this, the ease with which we were able to do it in React.